There we go. Yes, yes. All right. Very good. Welcome to FX Collaborative. I'm Michael Syracuse, partner here. We're recording too. So exciting to see you all here. This is for hopefully the first of many collaborations between FX Collaborative and our neighbors, all of you at Pratt just up the hill. We're really looking forward to more interactions, more events just like this. So for those of you who don't know, we moved here to 1 Willoughby Square, a building that we designed in late 2021. And we'll back up. And when we designed the space, we were formerly in the Flatiron District in 19th Street. And we thought of what aspects of our former office would we want to bring to this space. And in our former office and now in this office, this gallery space that we're in now is really the cultural heart of our office. It's a place that we bring in outside creative artists and exhibits and events to inspire the work that we do every day. So I can think of no better event than this one to be the inaugural event, inaugural exhibit in this space to inspire the creativity of our everyday work. So, to be here today in person, see all of these faces, not through a screen, is wonderful. To open our doors to all of you and welcome you in, have this inaugural show of student work on a site that's just a few blocks from here, with all of you and from Pratt, just a few blocks from here as well, and to tackle this important imperative issue of housing for all of our fellow New Yorkers and tackling important aspects like climate change really sets a high bar for future exhibits and future events in this space. So with that, we'll start the event and I'll hand it off to David. Welcome.
Thank you, Michael. I'm David Erdman, the chair of graduate architecture at Pratt Institute. And it's been my privilege and pleasure to bring this event together with our colleagues at FX Collaborative. As Michael indicated, it's the start of what we hope will be a series of events that we're working on together in their work on affordable housing, in relationship to building renovations, and some of the themes that have to do with climate justice and climate change in the East River Corridor. Our curriculum, what you're looking at around you in the room, is the third semester of a 6-semester program. It really starts to come down to the pinch point here and kick off the research trajectory of our students. We at Pratt really like to use the city and specifically downtown Brooklyn and the East River Corridor as an area of research to get the classroom out into the city. Basically, between Queensboro Bridge and the New York Harbor has been a primary area of focus in all of our core and fundamental studios. They all concentrate in this area, partly because of the questions about density that it raises and how that affected us in the pandemic, certain issues of inequities, and certain economic issues surrounding the area, as well as resource issues. This is some of the largest concentration of public housing estates, and also as a result of open land in a city that's rapidly densifying, and also an area that is vulnerable to rising tides. This brings together a number of important themes we think our students should be studying, and one in particular that revolves around issues of density, one of our primary areas of research in the graduate curriculum. What we learned from the pandemic is that population migration in urban areas are anticipated only to grow in the coming 25 to 50 years, and that behavioral patterns surrounding the pandemic can't be equated to densification. We also, in our programs, try to introduce to our students the importance of what I call the 3-part cocktail of the climate problem. Most architects focus on the 2 orange pieces of the pie: building consumption, embodied carbon, and building materials. The third part, transit, is quite critical. You'll often hear the statistic thrown around that architecture consumes and emits 70% of carbon on the planet. But when you break that down and you read the Paris Accord closely, most of that's transit. It's not the actual buildings that are consuming that. You barely break 10% in commercial and residential on the planetary stage. What drives that and what drove the Paris Accord and the interest in density is to get things to not move around as much. So the only city currently operating at the target set by the Paris Accord by 2026 is Hong Kong, because it is the most concentrated density of the 9 densest cities on the planet. And a big part of that is because it doubles down on that with transit. You start to see weird things happening in Hong Kong, like landscape architecture, conservation, and new construction mixed together. This project by Williams and Shen is about 30% new construction. You see early evidence of this kind of thinking in the discipline and profession in Europe already, where you'll see projects that are maybe 10 or 20% new construction, weird symptoms like new architecture sliding under old architecture or flipping the landscape up. These are all symptoms of what we think is important in an educational context in the 21st century, to teach for this, to teach for imaginative and creative modalities of building alteration. This is certainly something we've been witnessing in the area in New York City that I showed earlier, and that we see in NYCHA estates with retrofits. We see how that begins to impact those communities, questions about how it can alter and change them, as well as certain examples of this starting to play out across the city and in a number of those estates. So tonight we're going to hear from a number of different constituencies, a mixture of students presenting alongside faculty and industry leaders and thinkers. We're very happy to have 24, I think it's 24 students total in the show who were brought to us with 9 faculty. 12 of those students will be presenting tonight through 6 projects. Amongst the faculty presenting tonight are Eric Schonenberger, who directs the core sequence of our studios, is the principal of SU11 based in Williamsburg. So he oversees the first 4 studios. Wendy Sheffron of FX Collaborative, a partner and a principal and the director of affordable housing, will be sharing with us some of what FX Collaborative has been doing. Gerard Delane of the Delane Company, do I have that right? Is with us. Gerard doubles as a faculty member and fellow colleague, as well as a leader in the realm of affordable housing, and has been doing a lot of work in the Bronx, and I think is going to share some of the work he's been doing with NYCHA. And Dylan Baker Rice, who is the director of capital projects for NYCHA, and also a former colleague at Pratt's, which we're very happy to welcome back through this venue. It ends up that the 4 panelists are all Columbia graduates, which I didn't put together until I went through everybody's resume, which was interesting to see. And yet we've all had some landing at Pratt at some point in time or are still there. So it's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this evening's event. And we're going to start with Eric Schonenberger with a presentation of the studio. Thank you.
Hello. Yes. How do I get to? There we go. All right. I have to do this with 2 projects because I have speakers notes and they didn't really work. Good evening, everyone. My name is Eric Schoenberger, and I already lost my thing here. First, I would like to express my thanks to FX Collaborative and all the contributors to make tonight's event possible. Further, I would like to thank all students for the outstanding work throughout the semester and for all the efforts made to get the contents of this exhibition together. My role as a coordinator, in my role as a coordinator of the GAUD Semester 3 Design Studio, I would like to set the context of the conversation of tonight. I'm not intending to present any solutions, but rather to raise questions and set out the context of the different projects. So I'm going to go to this. So first, the Fall 21 Semester 3 Design Studio is titled Urbanities and Qualities, and it's broken down into 6 studio sections, led by 6 faculty members. So it was Shulan Kolotan, Stephanie Bayard, Carlos Arnes, Thomas Laser, Jim Garrison, and myself. So the site that we chose for the projects is Farragut Housing, and it's a high-rise. The project is a high-rise. The project the students were asked to do is a high-rise mixed-use project. Oops, yeah, this is complicated. So the context 1 is housing demand in urban areas. So here's an image of, oops, sorry. Oh, this is complicated. All right, so facts. Currently, 55% of world's population lives in urban areas. This ratio is forecasted to increase to 68% by 2050. 2 factors are the main contributors to this development. 1, population growth. The world population growth of roughly 1%, which adds about 81 million people per year. This ratio nets to roughly 2.5 billion people by the year 2050. So that's quite substantial. So this is a image about cities, migration and immigration. There is and has been a gradual shift of population from rural areas to cities and urban centers. The interplay between migration and urbanization poses both challenges and opportunities. For migrants, communities, cities, and government concerned. Cities are the primary destination for internal and international migration. Cities are the front lines of assisting migrants to find work and shelter. The search for better opportunities is one of the main reasons for migration. And here you see a chart of why people come to cities. Some of the urban densities and one of the outcome of migration to the cities is also that there's areas of low income, slums, and all kinds of conditions. So the question that I have here, how can a city provide housing for the constant increase in population, and how can housing development allow for communities and their cultural heritage to thrive? Context 2, 20th century housing. So going back first a bit, in this image you see rows of crowded, monotonous houses accommodating a great numbers of workers that were attracted by factory jobs during the Industrial Revolution. New York had a similar problem, of course. Here you see an image of the condition in the Lower East Side with New York's tenement housings. Oops. Then we go to, of course, housing, especially social housing. Research and design was introduced to the academic design institutions in the early 20th century. The Bauhaus, led by Walter Gropius, was at the forefront in developing new ideas and solutions for social housing. In this image, you see the Meckeritzstraße building in Großsiedlung Siemensstadt, developed by Hans Scharoun. It was built in 1929 and 1931 under the master plan of Hans Scharoun. 6 prominent Weimar architects were part of this development, and among them is Otto Bering, that's one of them, and another one from Walter Gropius. And this is Walter Gropius in the Weissenstadt Siedlung. Then another important one of the developments was the Karl Marx Hof Vienna. It was built between 1927 and 1930s by city planner Karl N. and a follower of Otto Wagner, designed for a population of about 5,000 on the premises, included many amenities, including laundromats, bath, kindergartens, a library, and so on. It was one of the largest housing development of its time, and was also made known because it was the longest building or the longest housing building. A next project that I want to bring up is Hanseviertel district in Walter Gropius. There were several a whole series of buildings after the Second World War by star architects of their time, including Alvar Aalto, Le Corbusier, Walter Gropius, Oskar Niemeyer, and they all came together to conjure the very best example of post-war urban communal living at the Hanseviertel. This is Gropius's building. And then among them was also Le Corbusier, who did Unité d'Habitation, featured in a graphic, painterly facade. The apartment, which ranged from 1 to 5 bedrooms, featured balconies, area glass partition, and views of surrounding parks. Next one was Oskar Niemeyer. Order and rhyme were integral to Brazilian architect Oskar Niemeyer. Concrete building designed with 78 apartments. Like most of the estate's housing, it was lifted off the ground to maintain views of the surrounding parks. Another one is the Swedish contributor to the Giant complex came from architects Rhys Janek and Sten Samuelson, whose whimsical design featured a cherry red facade on one side and bright blue on the opposite side. Now this development in Europe also led to changes in the US. This is a public housing timeline in the US, where 1935, the first public housing were built, and then it went throughout the time until housing legislations were implemented. This is in 1942, a new housing complex was completed in East Bronx. 51 new buildings with over 12,000 apartments made room for 40,000 people to live on just 129 acres, while still allowing for ample open space. So it might be that Dylan knows more about that, maybe. So this is another one of the New York housing projects. Of course, there came the often quoted example of modernist low-income housing project Prut-Igoe, the public housing complex in St. Louis, completed in 1956. It was celebrated as a haven for St. Louis' poorest residents when it first opened. Conditions after years of neglect, and then of course, 20 years later, Prut-Igoe was a symbol of urban decay and a de facto segregation of police that kept Blacks in city ghettos across the country. Drug addicts squatted in its abandoned buildings, windows went unfixed, and school children had to steer clear of dangerous gangs. In 1972, St. Louis declared the complex an emergency zone and evacuated its residents and imploded the 3 of the buildings with dynamite. 2 years later, the remaining buildings were also demolished. A great number of apartment high-rise buildings were developed throughout the world's largest urban centers. This is an image of that. And of course, there's the photographs of Michael Wolff, which capture the density and the immense size of these urban development. So I have a few of those, which are fairly amazing. So the question here is, how can academic research and design impact planning and design of residential building? My third context is energy consumption and densification. We heard some of it from David already. Pollution obviously is a emerging and very urgent context we're dealing with. And urban density is regarded as more sustainable environmentally, socially, and economically. By living together in close proximity, we can accommodate far more of the world's population, use less energy, concentrate goods and services, design ecologically and sensitive buildings, and move around efficiently. Manhattan Island is seen as the 20th century benchmark for density, with residential areas reaching 4,250 people per hectare. But New York City as a whole has just 180 people per hectare. This is a project from Copenhagen's company called COBE, and Willem Lauritz Architects is one of several European projects taking a mid-rise approach to urbanism. As a question, how dense is density? So context 4 is our context of mostly New York City. And I brought up a series of the newish towers or newer towers here. This is the 111th Street, West 57th Street Chop building. And then we have, of course, our neighbor here, the 340 Flatbush Avenue, also Shop. And then the 172 Madison Avenue by Raphael Vignoli. And the Frank Gehry at 9 Spruce Street. These are example of New York's high rise and tendency for high rise. And of course, we have to bring in Herzog de Meuron's 56 Leonard Street as another landmark of these buildings. So question, are high-rise buildings the solution for urban density? Context 5, the studio site. Our studio site is located in downtown Brooklyn. You see it on the right side, just peeking out, and it's really just on the border of all the dense development in downtown Brooklyn. Another aerial view of that with the Alloy building and the Shop tower in front. We have looked at Farragut housing property or development, and also looked at the FAR and density, and the FAR and density of the Farragut housing development is actually relatively low. It's 1.5 FAR. It's much lower than the area would allow. And the thought of the studio question is to find space in between, which are actually fairly, the 9 towers of Farragut housing, there's actually a fair amount of space in between. So we have located 6 sites between the buildings, and each studio section would have projects in pair, and each pair would take a studio section. Some studio sections, I must say, which we will see, also took the entire site for individual projects. Here's another aerial view of the Farragut housing development and an early rendering as it was developed. Construction of the Farragut housing is interesting because it's actually slab and post and slabs. The brick is just a facade, which is interesting, or was interesting for the students also to see how could they connect to some of these buildings and how could they interact with some of the buildings. Farragut housing towers were deemed to be some of the most efficient building in terms of their circulation, like the ratio of residential floor area versus circulation is as efficient as it can be, which ultimately probably also created a lot of problems. Here's another view. And of course, which I just wanted to make a small point of that, what's always important with residential is school and school districts, as many of you may know. And this is an image showing how the Dumbo area wants to rezone the school district so that the Farragut housing are actually out of it. And also another noteworthy point is that the medium income in Dumbo, which is literally just across the street from the Farragut housing, is about $200,000 versus the Farragut housing is $30,000. So it's an extreme sort of border between the Farragut housing site that we chose and the adjacent Dumbo area. And that's it for me. Thank you. it's gonna be Mel and Robin and Luis and Nicholas. Yes. I have to close this one now. Mel and Robin, right? Yes, here.
We'll present from there.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Here we go. All right, we should widescreen this. Wonderful. So this is Robin Smith and I'm Mel Chua. We're your 2 students and we were in Eric's studio in the fall of 2021. Our project is called Cosmosis because from a design perspective, we were thinking about how verticality and permeability could affect community. But from a sociological perspective, we really wanted to make things work on the ground so that, as Eric highlighted earlier, there could be much more interaction between the existing Farragut housing community and the public, the general public. So how do we do that? And so the first thing that we thought about when we were conceiving of a mixed use residential building is that we didn't want it to like tower over the Farragut houses. The Farragut housing is typically 14 floors. We have ours at around 18. So it's slightly taller, but it also employs a strategy that allows the public to really come into the building, circulate throughout, and culminate in an interfaith chapel on top of it. That is because our site is actually on the site of a former church, the Church of the Open Door, 70 years old, and it really grew with the Farragut housing towers. And the site also has like 2 rows of 70-year-old trees. So we really kind of wanted to preserve that sort of spiritual and community footprint in what we were going to accomplish.
This is a typical kind of mid-floor plan of the project. And contrary to the Farragut Towers, there's a real preference given to the public spaces of the building, which disperse throughout the floor plan from the central atrium through a series of, it's auto playing for some reason, through a series of single loaded corridors, which are punctuated with meeting spaces for residents to congregate. These corridors are split by horizontal light shafts, which divide the private living strands and provide light and views to all the circulation spaces. This represents a departure from the Farragut cores, which have no natural light and no spaces to meet and socialize in. The private spaces of the project are divided into 5 residential living strands, which begin and end at different elevations to provide cascading terraces for the residents with views over the BQE to the south and west. Each strand represents different living typology, including a strand for communal living with bedrooms off of kitchen and dining space, a strand with large floor plates for families, one with small 1-bedroom apartments for single people and couples, one strand of duplex apartments, which could serve multi-generational families, and one of super high density for short-term or hotel units. This versatility serves a diverse range of residents in which people in the building could move strands based on changing needs, family size, or income. Again, this contrasts with the Farragut Towers, which are dominated by identical 2-bedroom apartments and provide no flexibility for the residents' ever-changing needs.
We also wanted to think about how do we treat our indoor spaces so that they are efficient and that we could actually accommodate these different living topologies, but also how do we make it actually comfortable for the residents within it? As Robin mentioned, we have many generations of families hopefully to come and be living in these strands. So we were thinking about our interior strategy in particular. We have very efficient strands that are around a central core. We have movable walls that are not floor to ceiling. They're actually like 3/4 the height to allow airflow to move around the apartments. And we also have these exterior permeated screens as a skin to allow air and light to diffuse very softly throughout these units. So in this chunk model over here, you're seeing several of the strategies. One of them is a triple height communal space that allows sort of students to come in and live very efficiently. We have an interior strategy that actually mimics that of like first class airline in the way that you sort of live and eat and breathe and habitate and do your hygiene in one sort of continuous room. And we also kind of made our interior strategy in a way that modernizes the typical sort of nitrile blue tile that you see in a lot of the housing from the 1930s because of the Wagner Act. The 1937 Wagner Act dictated that in order for public housing to be funded, it should discourage middle-class families from attending and living there for long. So they were this kind of blue worn tile, and we really wanted to update that as we thought about how do we encourage people to really want to live in this building and interact with one another in the public atrium spaces, as well as in the hallways. How do we encourage those chance encounters?
So the building's surrounded by public outdoor space, including a community garden. There's two ways to enter the complex, one from the Nassau Street side near the BQE and one through the Farragut housing community. We wanted to create kind of a equal entrance on either side, which is why it lands on the ground on two legs with an approach from either side. The bottom floors of each vertical strand where they hit the ground contain commercial tenants and public amenities such as musical performance space, subsidized daycare, fitness center, and a restaurant. This programming allows for pleasant encounters to occur and for a community identity to be cultivated. Upon entering the building, the public's invited to circulate up to a 3-story atrium with the split level indoor balconies overlooking a cafe, allowing for visitors to relax, meet one another, and passively participate in activities such as public arts exhibitions, etc.
And here you can see exemplified in our ground floor plan that strategy where you have the subsidized daycare, fitness centers, and the two axes at which the existing Farragut housing community to come into the complex can traverse it, and people from Sand Street coming in from the corner of BQE can also engage. And then you see the upper floor plan that's also exemplifying our sort of efficient vertical living cores.
From this street view, you can see the kind of two spaces as they're coded throughout the building. So the perforated metal screen, which wraps the private living strands, with these punched openings at the balcony spaces where the perforated metal screen separates from the glazed facade within to create these semi-enclosed ventilated balcony spaces. On the interior, you can see the single loaded corridors with the vertical metal solar shading on them, which wrap into the central public atrium to further encourage this light and air and views into the public circulation spaces and foster this communal identity where people are meeting in the public spaces. And on the ground floor, you see the view of the public atrium, which could host community events or music or art exhibitions.
Here in section, you can see these lines. Especially the middle section, you can really see how we have these sort of double height atriums with interior balconies to really allow public exhibitions to, like the one we're in right now, to exist and for people to very casually convene. Oops. And on the flanking sections, you kind of see how our different vertical strands can accommodate different floor heights, and therefore create a more dynamic split level living situation. And finally, in this slide, you see exactly where our building is housed within the existing Farragut Towers. Again, near the BQE, a very kind of noisy place, not necessarily the most desirable corner, but I think throughout our different strategies and modes of access, we're trying to create a very community-like jovial energy in this specific site. So.
And this view also shows the light shafts that are cut through the floor plan and what these views now access, looking back over the BQE back towards Brooklyn or through the Farragut Towers out towards the water. So in conclusion, our intention with Cosmosis is that it provides a flexible living at a variety of scales and hopefully creates a cultural and generational diversity among our residents in the surrounding neighborhood. And
We welcome any questions, I guess.
thank you.
Does it work? Yeah. Thank you first to FX Collaborative and GUD for making this possible. I think it's a critical matter that is interesting to discuss here. And I think if you press spacebar, no? Okay. Well, my partner, Luis Rodriguez, and myself, Nicholas Schlegel, will present you one proposal. At the genesis of our project, we defined housing as commons that encompasses a multi-use program based on housing and craftsmanship. Craftsmanship as a cultural commons becomes a reality when we used the traditional market, plaza, and circulation and production place as a vertical element aggregated with a modular framework.
Can you hear me? Yes. The ground level is left open to maintain the natural flow of circulation and preserve the natural environment, such as trees and birds or other species. The three cores contain programmatic spaces such as gallery exhibition and the residential lobbies, as well as for the building systems.
The living spaces at the higher levels are fractally distributed throughout the building around generating the nucleus for the workshops. The larger aggregation in the center is a common workshop where people can interact, learn, and teach from each other. The housing units are interconnected by a smaller workshop area that is more private, but separates the place from where we live and the place where we work.
So the fractal aggregation is scaled down to create a modular framework. This modular framework consists of studios, duplex, and triplex that will be flexible and meet the demands of the living patterns of the people who lived in them. It's also important to know that the workshops and the living would be interlocked together.
Our roof aggregation generates multitudes of possibilities. The first being terraces for each unit, then a smaller scale that becomes circulation, outdoor circulation, and a third scale that becomes for the non-human parts of the building, such as fauna and birds. The dialogue between both enables a cohabitation that we think is necessary for the well-being of all. But we also allow the birds who naturally pick the calcium in the facade for the digestive system. So we provide them a more porous mineral that they could, throughout the years, they could reshape how the building is perceived, as well as the use of the humans.
The scaling of the fractal aggregates helps us to define a dialogue between both humans and non-humans, so they can habitate in the nooks and crannies as well as for the bigger scale for the humans, Nico just said. So as for building systems, we chose the site offers us a possibility to use geothermal. It's crucial for density and high rise. And we used geothermal because it has low carbon, it is energy efficient, and it requires low maintenance. It will keep the building stable at temperatures during the seasons.
As a structural system, we propose Verandil trusses that are elevated from the ground and are attached to the 3 cores that hold the vertical circulation, as well as the shafts for the geothermal and the building techniques.
The geothermal will be placed in the north and the south core.
So in overall, this building is a new proposal that redefines typical housing as a cultural, by integrating workshop as a cultural commons. And
The living is a biological entity that will work with nature and will sustain human workforce to work with the community. So the sustainability of the building and the community will meet its needs and demands. Yes.
thank you.
Autoplaying. I don't know how to stop it. I wish
No, but isn't there a way to? Auto option or auto play? Advanced every check. Advanced every.
Don't go anywhere.
Excellent. I'm excited it's up. So again, I'm Wendy Shaffrin. I'm Principal and Director of Affordable Housing at FX Collaborative. To reiterate what Michael said earlier, it's really great to see everybody here, and it was nice to see everybody's work so far. Excited to see more of what's going to come. And we wanted to just share a little of our work as well. So FX Collaborative is a group of about 110 architects and designers. And the mission of our firm really is to use design as a tool to create a positive, meaningful impact in the world. There's 3 main drivers of our work: intelligence, intuition, and interconnection. Intelligence is the things we know, our knowledge, our experiences, things we learned over the course of the years. Intuition is more of our perceptions, our observations of the world. And interconnection is how this fits into our larger context. And our practice really exists at the intersection, kind of that overlap of colors in that center area. We are a holistic design firm. We design at a very large range of scales, everything from planning, large-scale master plans, infrastructure, cultural, interiors, commercial, and residential. A large portion of our practice is residential. You can see we design at a large different scale, all different typologies, market sector, affordable, and everything in between. Now we've done a lot of units, about 10,000 total units. We're looking to increase that number. We have about 1 million square feet currently under construction and about 3,000 affordable units. And the strength of our firm really is our people. They're very passionate about what we do, very strong, inclusive culture, committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this diversity of perspective is especially important in residential projects and thinking about the diversity of the population of the city who's going to live there. So we're kind of experts in residential design. We know kind of all the ins and outs, all the technical constraints, systems, but we like to balance that against kind of an overall vision of crafting spaces and layouts for life. So a lot of the themes that you were discussing in your projects this evening of, private and shared space, inside and outside, exterior, sustainability, as well as responding to the pandemic and how we might want to think about design differently. And we design, like I mentioned, at all different scales, from small studios to really large, complex buildings. And it's taking all this complexity of the code and the zoning and the building system and packaging that and integrating into the goals and vision for the project. Sustainable and resilient design is something that's very important to us and something we really try to bake into our projects and use as something that informs our work and helps shape it. And I've had the benefit of being in this space for the past couple of days, walking around and reading some of your descriptions. And this is kind of the themes that I've noticed on a lot of your work. Things like densification, user comfort, connection to nature, pandemic responsiveness. And I thought it'd be interesting to just share some of our work that kind of I think will resonate with some of these themes. And when you think of residential or really any of our projects, it has to be successful on two different scales. There's the urban scale, kind of the outside in, the pressures and constraints of the city and how that filters in, as well as the micro scale, the apartment, much smaller scale, and somebody being in the apartment in that experience. So first project I'm going to share with you today is Apex Place. So this is in Forest Hills. This was actually a former NYCHA campus that had been privatized about 30 years ago. And I think back in 2017, the tenant board actually voted to approach a group of developers to sell a portion of the land to build housing there to help them replenish their funds and create repairs. So if you see the three reddish buildings, those are the existing buildings. The white buildings are the new buildings. And there's a lot of themes here that I think are also the themes that came up in your work of connection to nature, urban connection, densification of the superblock, and sustainability. And you see the site, this is what it was before we did the project. It's constrained on one side by the Long Island Expressway. There is a lot of paved area, a lot of parking, and then three buildings. And there is some open space, but it isn't very well defined. And it's, I think, not used in the way it could have been to its full potential. So in thinking of our approach to the site, first we looked at framing the site. That's both sheltering the site from the Long Island Expressway and from the noise and motion over there, creating a central open space and creating meaningful open spaces and connections from there, and engaging the corners and creating that street presence that the kind of 1970s tower in the park didn't really have. Then enhanced garden entrances, so connecting back to the city and having multiple areas around the site that connect back to that center green. And also about cracking it open and looking at the existing buildings to see what we could learn from that and putting in the new buildings, about having multiple connections at the ground floor so it feels more permeable, as well as having daylight in all the corridors, and this play of textures between kind of the rough and the smooth. And an opportunity we have here that we don't always have in some of our other works, something large like that, is to really have the massing and the approach to the project be informed by sustainability and kind of solar exposure and the best orientation. And this is a view showing the connections and those walkways and those extra gardening connections we added. A view of the center green. The sheltering of the site along the Long Island Expressway. And these are those sheared volumes that are creating that play of different textures as well as those areas for light. The second project I'm going to share with you is La Centrale. So this is also a big urban campus, but this was all a new project. So it's 5 buildings centered around an urban green with a lot of community facility space and a new YMCA. So some of the themes here that I think resonate are the mixture of uses, the urban connection, creating community, and again, sustainability. And kind of the 3 approaches we had here was thinking about the garden apartments and that smaller, more intimate scale, access to nature, kind of that density that we're looking for in the towers in the park, and an active urban grid, and adding them all together to find an order and a strategy for the site. As you see, there's a lot of, it's kind of like creating not just a building, but entire community and a new neighborhood. There's a lot of retail space, community facility, a new YMCA, supportive housing, and almost 100,000 square feet of affordable housing. I see over here, the programming, there's a large center green, but then there's also a skate park, daycare, Grow NYC, and a lot of urban and pedestrian connections. And then having looked more at the larger scale and the urban context, now I'm just going to talk a little more about the micro scale and the interior habitat. So some of the things we have always been doing, but now are more sensitive to, especially and have greater awareness with the health crisis and equity issues of the past few years, are health and wellness, flexibility, sustainability, comfort, and equity. So thinking about where a lot of these affordable housing complexes in NYCHA are located, they're often at kind of more of the perimeter near an expressway. I think one of the students was mentioning that in presentations. And there's often very poor air quality. There's also a lot of paved surfaces. You saw there's like large expanse of parking. So I think the combination of those two really do kind of necessitate looking at health and wellness through a very focused lens to try to mitigate those effects. And there's the social determinants of health. There's polluted air and making sure it doesn't get inside, healthy materials, daylight and views, and even glare and light fixtures, and considering all those factors for the interior habitat. And I think all of that starts first at the exterior of the building, of creating a very robust exterior wall envelope. We try to design our projects to either Passive House or Passive House standards. And what that does is it really improves the comfort and the health of the interior. Yes, the happy person and the not as happy person. So, there's no draft. You have fresh air. There's improvement for windows. Also, from an energy perspective and an equity perspective, it reduces costs for people living there if they have, their heating and cooling costs. So there's kind of many benefits in intersection with health, wellness, and sustainability. And something else that we've been talking about since March 2020 is, how does the pandemic or how should it affect residential design and what should we be thinking about? So it started off more as a discussion of pandemic responsiveness, but it quickly became a discussion of how do we design for equity and for health and wellness. And this is one of the images from an RFP we had done a couple of years ago of the neighborhood demographic. And just thinking about, I think similar to like that vertical strand project we were hearing about earlier, thinking about flexibility and the different family types of people who live in the spaces and how we could take that more into account when we design. And we've been looking also, a typical 1-bedroom unit that we've been doing prior to, back in 2019. And what are the small moves in our power that we can make to contribute to enhancing that environment? Could we add extra green space for people? Could we think about how people are using the space a little differently, provide more space for a home office, as well as maybe we want to move like the bathroom at the entrance to the apartment from a hygiene perspective. And then talking mostly about new construction, but there's billions of square feet of existing construction. That's also something that ingesting density and the housing crisis is something that has to be accounted for. So we also been working with industry to come up with scalable solutions that could actually make an impact in this realm. So we've been working on an overcloud. A lot of times when there's an upgrade, residents have either have to move out or are disrupted for a long time. So working on a system to be able to minimize the impact on the tenants and have them stay in place. Okay, and with that, like what are the takeaways and what are our aspirations for the future? It's been a difficult few years and there have been a lot of challenges, but I think it's also raised a lot of awareness, like equity of health, of wellness. Maybe it's an opportunity to think of the future of our cities a little differently. So kind of exciting to see kind of all this creativity and work and kind of just optimistic about being able to have an impact moving forward. That's it for me.
Control L. Hi, my name's Priscilla Sue, and this is my partner Sakena Asar, and this is our project Bionic Ecology. So our housing project is at the intersection of technology and nature. Located on the northeast corner of Farragut Housing in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, this project imagines a future where resources are redistributed that is sensitive to local needs while also understanding regional climate influences. As it exists today, many urban communities face food deserts. This project does not only aim to create a machine, but to also provide collective new living spaces. Especially for low-income housing, access to high-quality foods is not easily accessible.
So here we introduce agricultural programming through hydroponic gardens, water filtration system, waste compost and energy system. And from this programming, the building functions as a machine, a metabolic system that is self-sufficient.
This building holds multifamily housing, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom units. The multifamily housing is located on the west side of site as it has more access to yard space. The 1-bedroom units are mostly located within the tower, as well as the 2-bedroom units are located on the east side of the site.
The materials and their spatial relationships drove the idea of ambiguation in our form. This is a reference to the relationship of the existing neighborhood and nature, an ambiguous engagement with its environment. Our language is a refraction of light and space. We use both channel glass and brick, and the brick is a reflection of the history of the Farragut houses, while the channel glass is reinforcing ambiguity and refraction.
The IPCC report states that the world's resources are predicted to deplete in 6 years. These issues call on urgent redesign of spaces to ensure the survival of neighborhoods. By centralizing our resources and creating a metabolic, self-reliant machine, the community benefits from their individual living spaces. I'm Priscilla Sue, and this is Sakena Asar, and this is our Bionic Ecology project. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Dana, and this is my partner, Danielle. So our project uses a strategy of porosity and delamination in order to tie the building into its site to connect the project with other waterfront developments, as well as celebrate rainwater by creating a building that operates as an extensive rain garden. So by unraveling the mass of a traditional housing block, tenants and visitors are able to occupy all surfaces of the building. And we are also able to implement plantings and water collection devices across the height of the building in order to filter the water before it reaches the ground. So in looking at Farragut housing in its urban context, one main concern that we had was the extensive amount of fencing that was on the site that went beyond a sense of security and towards a sense of division and if not confinement. So a priority of the project was to resolve primarily the division between the individual housing buildings, but also the housing project as a whole and its context. So our decision to build on the lot in the upper right-hand corner of the site, the northeast corner of the site, was because it had the opportunity to resolve these two different kinds of divisions that happened in Farragut. And also it was driven by a desire to extend existing walk and bike paths that extend down to the riverfront.
Flood risk area is projected to cover at least a third of the Farragut housing site by 2080. However, rainwater flows across the site and creates an opportunity to absorb it and redirect it. Our site strategy was to delaminate the ground and emulate the winding slopes and varying levels of rain gardens. Connective gutters could lead to occupiable swales that line the arterial moments of the project. We wanted to carry the concept of horizontal flow and vertical porosity from the site to the building. The hallways grow and shrink in thickness, creating open-ended communal spaces, possibly for socializing with neighbors, storing your bicycle, or to get a change of scenery for those who might be working from home. While the expanding and contraction of strands allows for fluctuating circulation, the shifting also allows for the top units to have private or communal balconies. Bottom units without balconies have skylights and built-in planters along the window frame.
Because the project is located on the edge of the site, we prioritized having a porous structure in order to avoid intersecting sight lines for current residences. And also this process of delamination is also what allowed both the interior and exterior of the building to be occupied and have the outside of the building extend down into the circulation through the site. So additionally, using this strand structure allowed us to extend walkways into the existing Farragut housing buildings, which would give current residents access to the new amenities, but also because the buildings are currently underserved, as in there's like insufficient maintenance, they often lack functional, adequate vertical circulation. So by connecting them, they have more access points to get up to their homes, but also it sets a precedent for more interconnected infrastructure across the site.
Units are stacked along a continuous hallway along an ADA compliant slope, allowing access between levels. By having built-in gutters that line the edges of the building, the slope simultaneously allows for rainwater to be slowed down before reaching the ground. By synchronizing the flow of people and water and allowing opportunities for interaction and veneration, our project aims to address flooding, but also to restore the connection that the Farragut residents once had with the East River. Coincidentally, the usage of and interaction with rainwater, whether through rain gardens or sprinkler playgrounds, could prevent the local sewers from being overwhelmed, thus reducing the combined sewage outflow that pollutes the East River. Thank you.
Testing. Okay. Good evening, everybody. My name is Gerard Delane, professor at Pratt. Thank you, David, for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Today, I want to talk to you about how can we help communities grow? You know, for you young designers to be architects and builders one day, people are afraid of change. And just so happened, we're in the business of change. So you walk in with this bias, like, don't you want this? That you have to realize that, you know, what we're doing, what we're creating, we have to use a little emotional intelligence in what we're presenting. And one day you're going to be presenting to a community board. You're going to really need this skill. Because everybody's not going to love change. Everybody's not going to love new. So I want to talk a little bit about public housing in New York City in particular, and my interpretation on things we could do going forward. So challenge, we have to make public housing better. Doing nothing, I personally think, is not an option, right? We all know, these buildings weren't necessarily built out of love and care. And that going forward, we have to make things better, right? A little bit of history. We'll talk real quick. HUD founded in the earlier part of the 1900s. FHA in particular helped, finance housing across the country. HUD and FHA are kind of tied together, but they're not one and the same. For much of the time between 1934 and 1968, it was largely segregated legally until the Civil Rights Act, at which the federal government said, you guys really shouldn't do this anymore, right? This arrangement worked pretty well for a while. Public housing was largely for soldiers coming back from the war, working class people, although there was a lot of segregation going on. They largely were functional. The government was supporting them and providing the needed resources for a lot of the early years in the process. Things changed dramatically in the 1960s, as somebody showed in an earlier presentation. Federal support for the programs started to dwindle. We fast forward to the 1980s, and the government decided only very low income folks should live in these communities, which kind of changed the character of the situation. That wasn't always the point. Was for large densities of lower income people being together, and tie in policing and education and other pieces. They all added up to very negative situations, right? And the buildings, of course, declined. Pruitt-Igoe was one famous example in America where the decline of these public housing buildings, what's the worst thing that could happen? And Pruitt-Igoe is a great example of, no resources, right? No employment, no men in the home, had very, very bad outcomes. So a little bit about NYCHA for a second. NYCHA, one of the first agencies of its kind. For those of you who don't know, NYCHA is about 25% of America's public housing today. So we're a very big, important part of the country's public housing stock. It's really big, it's really large, and they're a very important part of our voting block here, right? So we got to keep it. So we need to figure out some solutions on how to make it better, right? And a large portion of it is older folks, right? It's not folks that are just going to go and rejoin the working force. We have a lot of working folks that are now 1, 2 generations, 3 generations in a lot of cases in these homes. We as designers, this is an opportunity. How can we provide better housing for our neighbors, for our community members? The RAD program, which is a program that HUD came up with as a way to refinance these properties, come up with better ways to turn them over, because no longer is the government financing public housing the way it used to, right? 1940s, 50s, 60s, the government paid for it, built it, and managed it. The federal government decided it doesn't want to do that anymore, right? So, the LIHTC programs created and other programs were created that now private developers come in and build and create what we now call affordable housing across America. In New York City, we now have the PAC program, which utilizes the RAD program as a way of, how do we do something new, right? Just doing nothing is not acceptable to a lot of us, that we have to do something new in these communities. And PACT is a program that we're utilizing here in New York City. In urban cities across America, New York City being the largest one, there's lots of new change going on, right? New York's going through a lot of change. Smaller cities around America, they're all dealing with this problem of growth, lots of people, lots of change. How do we create enough housing for everybody? How do we create enough transportation for everybody? We don't have enough of it, right? So Part of our job as us builders, as creators, is how can we create compelling space for folks? How can we create resilient space? How can we create integrated spaces that aren't segregated like it was in previous generations? And there's a number of factors that need to come into play to do that. We're not going to solve them all tonight, but sustainability obviously is important. We have to be able to create spaces that can last for generations beyond now. We have to create spaces that are resilient. We have to react to the fact that, you know, climate change is real. The environment is pushing back against us. We have to create spaces that work, you know, in the ecology. You know, we have to work with the environment and create great spaces for that. Also, wellness. I'm a big believer in sustainability and wellness, that we can create buildings that makes people's lives better. I am a believer that we can do that, right? We can create buildings that give us good air, right? And give us natural light while we're working, right? So that we can have a better living experience. Because the majority of our human existence is inside of buildings. Can those buildings make people's lives better? I do believe that. And wellness and a few other things out there are ways that which you can measure that happen. Briefly, I'm going to talk about, I consulted a team on a NYCHA PAC submission, and here's kind of our interpretation on how to address the issue. So it was a portfolio up in East Harlem. It was about 1,000 units, and we could build 500 units as well. You know, it's a classic example. Lots of older buildings. Some streets are a little rougher than others, and lots of campuses. You know, green space in the yards that weren't really utilized, common areas that weren't utilized anymore, laundry rooms that were shut down years ago, playgrounds that were shut down. And we wanted to come in and create something new. And for the new pieces of property, we were going to build 2 new buildings. One would be affordable housing, one would be mixed income. And there's an ongoing debate about what we should do on the land. You know, as I said earlier, a few minutes ago, putting a large density of lower income people without resources has not really worked out well. So going forward, what can we do? Obviously, we don't want to do gentrification and just completely blocking people out, but how can we thoughtfully evolve and grow communities, right? You know, this site in particular, one of the sites, you know, across the street, there's a famous movie back in the day. If you ever seen it, New Jack City, it's across the street. You know, there's lots of loitering outside and the spaces just aren't inviting. So like part of our design of the exterior space is like, how can we create spaces that are good social spaces, healthy spaces, you know, not just saying, don't be outside, don't be in the yard, because many public housing buildings, right, they have where you're not supposed to walk on the grass, right? You're not supposed to use outside space, just walk through. It's just utilitarian. How can we create it that it's like, no, like you can have a birthday party, you can enjoy the place where you live, right? So part of it is we activated the public space. That no, we want kids to be able to come out and play. You know, one of the campuses, we created a dog park, right? Because people have dogs. Like, yeah, that's a social space, right? People love dogs, love dogs. And how can you create space where they can get together with their neighbors on their campuses? Here's an example of our proposal for the site. So the gray boxes there, they actually were parking lots. So we you know, proposed designing on the parking lot and then created green spaces in between them. We put the dog park right there. And we put a therapeutic garden right there, and tried to, you know, do a little programming. We've talked to a local green consulting firm that's going to help us create planting areas so that we can do not only urban farming, but actually create space for seniors to come outside. Like I said earlier, many of NYCHA buildings are filled with lots of seniors. How can we give them space to come out and socialize with each other, right? And not just in a TV room in the basement, but actually some space where they can come outside, get some fresh air, meet with their neighbors. Again, just thoughtfully coming up with ways that people can use the spaces going forward. A few innovative ideas we did in the presentation was historic tax credits. You know, for those who don't know, I know we have a few historic preservation folks, but you know, you can use tax credits to help finance and help pay for renovations. We also, wanted to bring in smart building technology like motion sensing lighting. We're thinking about creating where the young people can be able to track the energy usage and kind of gamify the idea of like energy conservation as a new way of engaging folks that live there with the building. We also brought on a consultant named Silicon Harlem. They're going to not only give high-speed internet for free, but they're also going to create classes that young people can learn about technology, right? So again, like these spaces weren't created out of love and care, right? So how can we create a situation where, not only are we bringing in higher income people to change the situation, but how can we train the next generation so they can also go out into the workforce and not have to leave the neighborhood, right? One of the downsides of HUD previously was that if you made too much money, you had to leave. So then you had a community with only poor people. Again, that has historically not turned out to be a very good thing. So I'm going to end it there. Wonderful presentations, which I'm seeing from all the students. This is so awesome. And I look forward to seeing your work into the future. Thanks for having me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amy.
I'm Jessie.
We're representing Garrison's Fall Studio. Our studio and also Leaser Studio actually approached this project at a master plan level. Okay, just checking. Okay. Our project responds to the context and community of the Farragut houses, in particular, the issue of food scarcity, community engagement, as well as maximizing the productivity of the land square footage. We started our research by visiting the housing development and leaving with a desire to revitalize the liveliness of the housing project, to make the most of the unused spaces in between the towers, and to find a way to mitigate the lack of affordable food resources for the residents, as well as the food scarcity issue for the larger metropolitan area. So at the bird's eye view of our project, we tackled food scarcity within the Farragut houses with the aim to provide any surplus food to the greater metropolitan area via traditional farming methods, as well as vertical farming. We've distributed 10 different crops to the 10 existing towers, which we'll elaborate on later. So just for site context, we did add additional housing, which allowed for up to 4,200 additional residents, and the existing population of the Farragut housing community already had 3,200 people living there. And with our farming production at an industrial scale, the vertical farms could produce enough to feed 30,000 people, whereas the traditional farming methods could produce half of that, or produce enough to feed half of that. And so all of that combined would be able to feed the existing Farragut population, the additional Farragut population, as well as a portion of the New York City metropolitan population of 22,000 out of 9 million.
So there are three main parts in our design. It's the vertical farm on top of the existing Farragut house and all the additional housing linking all the towers. And by redesigning and attaching new additions to the house, space will be utilized more efficiently with supplemental private and communal functions. Based on the original housing structure, we developed a cubicle balcony system that provides better ventilation, sunlight, and flexible uses. So starting from the top is the industrial vertical farm. we researched how much each produce the towers would need to feed the Farragut community and maybe some populations in other boroughs of New York City. And that calculation leads to the differing tower heights. In between the vertical farm and the existing Farragut house is one level of supporting programs that deal with the primary processing and packaging of the produce from the vertical farm. And this level will provide potential job opportunities to the residents on the site. And all vertical farms are located with research on solar paths to ensure all farm produce can get enough natural lights on top of having the special LED lights that allow photosynthesis to continue 24/7. Within the vertical farms, the main solar system we will be using is a hybrid of aeroponic and hydroponic. The intention of having the industrial farm on top of on the top with glass facade that reveals all the activities inside is to make a statement and raise awareness of the food insecurity issue. With the glowing farm on the top, Farragut house could be seen from very far with very specific identity.
One of our unrealized ideas was to have solar panels along the facade of the vertical farms. And it was supposed to be more for like to create energy self-sufficiency within the vertical farms. And if there was enough to power the rest of the, or some part of the rest of the building. Like in the upper right-hand corner, there's a render, an old render we had, where it's in this sort of pattern along the facade, but it could also easily be on the rooftops at an angle. And then in the 3rd to 14th floors, the 3rd to 14th floor of the towers are residential. And so this is a partial floor plan that shows how our layout would be. And we kind of reprogrammed the existing Farragut towers and then have like added enclosed balconies as well as like communal spaces in between in the additional housing areas. And so this is an example of one of the how it feels like to be in one of the enclosed balconies where
yeah, so this is also an idea to for the residents to have equal access to nature, and also this is an additional space for the residents, like especially at this special period of time, like in home office as an option.
And then at the bottom 2 floors, we have like commercial and public spaces. Within the existing Farragut towers would be learning exhibits for visitors or residents to learn about the farming production, how that works. And then within the additional housing are like cafes and produce markets that would source food from the vertical farms and the traditional farms. And then also affordable grocery stores for the local community to buy from. And this is an example of how, or of one of the public spaces that residents and visitors could go to with like the traditional farming in the background. And then this would be the spaces in between the towers for traditional farming, where people can gather and also interact with their food and how it's being grown after going through which would work in tandem with like the learning exhibits within the Farragut community. And I think that's it for us. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Yazid and this is Matt. We're going to present the UOL housing, which is, of course, an Farragut housing. And what is special about Farragut housing is it's for low income, as this map shows. And what is unique about it is it's in the middle of a very high income development, which kind of problematic and causes some social and economic issue. So we try to look for solutions for this problem, and the best way for us was to weave them together in a way that is not forced. And to do that, we came up with a UOL typology, which represent a different way of connecting those towers together. So we have like this catalog with all of the three main connections, and then we try to aggregate them together and use the towers as the main generators to create those kind of bridging and residential components at the same time.
And the components based off the UOL represent different relationships of privacy and openness. So this is a little GIF of the porosity of our site, of our project. From elevation, it looks quite monolithic, but as you move through the space and you look up and through the different components as they stretch over, it's rather porous and not as monolithic as it may seem from the street. Here we start to talk about the components that were driven by the towers themselves. As Eric mentioned, the brick on the building is just a facade, so it was pretty easy to connect into the structure to allow these components to connect. So there's various unit variations, and they connect through an interlocking corridor in the center level, 3 levels per component, and they're usually 2, 3, or 4 bedroom apartments. The larger, the components house the larger units, while the original towers hold 1 bedroom apartments or studio apartments.
Yeah, and also like for like materiality, we decided to have 3 different materials. One that represent the original tower, which is brick, and then we have the glaze system, which is the white component, and we have the blue material that wraps all the components together. So if we take like parts of the same component, we can see how the space quality inside each apartment.
And in certain instances, the corridor meanders from the center of the middle level of the component to the outside, and sometimes stretches up and allowing the apartments that it interacts with to have a private balcony. So this is a bit about the glazing system. Triple pane glass with expanded mesh, a white expanded mesh, to allow for opacity from the outside and translucency from the inside.
Yeah.
And this is our ground aggregation strategy. Our main goal is to really weave the communities surrounding the site. So creating an interesting ground relationship is really what we wanted to do here. We took the components and set them into the ground and then removed them and either, extruded or depressed them further to create different spaces. And then we started to program these spaces out with things we thought the neighborhood could use, grocery stores, gymnasiums, health clinics, and then just public open park spaces for people to go and hang out and converse. And we noticed from our site visit that people were really just hanging out right in front of the buildings. There wasn't really space for them to chill, I guess, and all the green space was fenced off and divided. You weren't really welcomed to occupy that space.
And this is like the overall project, and you can see how the original brick building goes even to the extends to the new components, and then the blue thing wraps all of the components together. And here also we can see how ground level is very open, and it's for everyone, and it's very inviting and welcoming. But at like certain moments where the program requires a connection, some of the components like goes down and touch the ground.
Right, so this is the ground floor plan, and as Yazid said, when the components come to the ground, the program changes. Anything that doesn't touch the ground is living space for the residents, but when it comes down, the program changes. And here is a grocery store. On the previous slide, there was an auditorium and arts center.
Yeah, this one.
Here. And then grocery store, and the towers themselves, the ground level has become just community space with study rooms and lounge spaces. And then these operate as personal kiosks where residents can set up, items to sell, or maybe they have a side business that they'd like to promote, something like that.
And for upper floors, we can see like how the connections between the new components and like the original towers.
Right. So as I said earlier, the apartments within the existing towers are 1 bedroom or studio, and then the larger living spaces exist within the components. This is a chunk illustrating that relationship of the programmatic change. And this is just another view.
And here are like some close-ups for like different moments. Why it's not. Okay, so sorry. Oops. Okay, I don't know what's happening. I have to wait. Okay. Okay.
Those are all the corridors removed.
Yeah.
I think that's it for us.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Dylan Baker Rice. I'm the design director for NYCHA's Capital Projects division. So capital projects, for those that you don't know, is basically new projects. So new construction, building works that goes on. Thank you for the wonderful presentations. A lot of exciting stuff to think about. So I thought I would just structure this mostly around a little bit of the history of NYCHA and a little bit on our current initiatives. So you get an idea of sort of where we're going right now. So this is, of course, where we were, the kind of historic view. And, when this was built, this was sort of state of the art. This is kind of where we're at. NYCHA is huge. I'll talk a little bit more about it, but we are the largest landlord basically in New York City. And we have so the most significant population in terms of tenants. And many of our developments or campuses, as you call them, look like this. They're kind of the typical brick tower in the park. And that is good. And it comes with lots of challenges. So this is kind of the history, and Gerard touched on it a little bit. There was kind of the first idea that public housing is something that's needed. That happened sort of at the turn of the century. By 1935, we had our first development, which is called First Houses. It's on the Lower East Side. And actually, we're there right now redoing the roofs and a lot of other work. It's a historic building. By about the 40s, you start to see from the influence primarily coming from Europe, the idea of what we call towers in the park. So the kind of first smattering of high rises, and the first buildings were more modeled off of tenement buildings, but we started to see this idea of green space in between being really important. By the 70s, that really took on its kind of full force, and it started to create the buildings that you recognize now around the city, is much taller. And then later in the 80s, there was an idea to kind of integrate these more into the community, what you call the kind of scattered site typology. So they started to fracture up these tall buildings. There's a belief that these buildings didn't work. A lot of it is programming and structural problems. But there was an idea of greater integration, and in some cases that's worked. In a lot of cases, it hasn't. So this is just quite of a snapshot of some of the developments around. You can see how varied the typologies are, both in terms of the building footprint, the height of the buildings, the density, the open space between them. Incredibly varied. It depends on the location. It depends on when it was built. It depends on the number of residents there. Yeah, but as I was saying, so we are 33rd in population size in the US. So the number of residents is larger than Sacramento, Atlanta, and Miami, assuming New York's first. 70% of our portfolio is actually open space. So the tower and the park typology means that we have a lot of green space, which is historically a very underutilized amenity for the surrounding communities. And so 1 of every 15 New Yorkers lives within public housing within NYCHA. So again, 2,547 public housing buildings. Sorry, it's a little blurry here. 8% is officially what we are of the rental market. We cover 2,400 acres. So 600,000 residents, roughly 500,000 officially. So that number varies quite a bit because there's a lot of people that live there. They have extended families. They stay with them. So there's a lot of people that are living in the buildings that aren't officially counted as residents. And then the makeup, we're shifting demographically. It's becoming a much older group of people because people have been there for a long time. So they're kind of aging in place. There's a big question of how we serve people. Sometimes we have people, they've been in a really large unit because they had a family and the family moved away, and a 3-bedroom is occupied by a single person. And then you have a newer, younger family in a very small 1-bedroom apartment, and they're crammed in, and maybe they have, relatives that live with them. 107,000 children. 25% of NYCHA employees also reside within our developments. 38% are of head of household, so 62 years or older. You can see there that average household income is way below the median for most of the areas they're located. So that's a huge difference. But most people are, working. There's a lot of city workers. There's quite a variety of jobs that people have, but it's definitely below the kind of median income. 54% are employed, 41% on fixed income, and 13% receive public assistance. So it's a very diverse group of people that live within public housing, sorry. So I'm kind of skipping ahead. So we have a number of initiatives, and I just wanted to share a few of them with you. This one is Connected Communities. So one of the big mandates of public housing, specifically now that it's overseen by HUD, which is the federal agency, is to improve the quality. So historically, because there's been a funding deficit, there's really been a lack of upkeep, and there's a huge need to improve the quality of living at these places. So the developments have suffered from disinvestment for a long time. And rather than just going in and saying what needs to be done, there's also an acknowledgement that it needs to be about engagement. We need to engage with the community more. We need to engage stakeholders. We need to hear what the residents want, because the residents are very unhappy with the way things have been for a long period of time. So The Connected Communities is one of the initiatives to have much more what we'd say participatory design, where we're going to residents and really engaging them early on in the design process, as opposed to just telling them how it should be. And out of that has come our open space master plan. So that's really looking at all the open spaces comprehensively. This is actually online. We're cataloging the open spaces and coming up with ideas of what we can put in those open spaces. So sometimes it's improvements on playgrounds. Other times it might be opportunities for new buildings, new construction with the PAC program. But the idea is to catalog that and to make that a kind of public facing resource. And so this is just a quick slide as well on our open spaces. The idea of uses for different people. We want to have more opportunities for children. We want to have more opportunities for residents, particularly older residents, to have specialized places. You can see in terms of our portfolio, 88% are kind of lawns or open areas. I think the comment came up is like, why do we have fences everywhere? It was actually a mandate from 1978 or so around security. And it's very much acknowledged that that doesn't make any sense anymore, to just have this only as a visual amenity. Active recreation, it's 10%. There's a big want to increase that, but also to change the versions of use that we have. And 2% is passive recreation, so just the kind of sitting space. So you can see here, one of our big challenges is only 3.5% of the space is actually really designed for resident use. So anyways, we've done a number of studies on these open space. This is also available online. This is kind of an example of it where we're looking at here. This is a development called Morris Houses. There's analysis about what it could be. So uses on fitness space, idea for central commons, different uses, different amenities, possibilities for locating other buildings, improving access, improving security and sight lines, right? And all those go into examples of design recommendations. So these are kind of standards that we have and have been developing about how to better utilize these spaces. So they're not just maybe what you've seen at Farragut, which is the kind of grassy lawn areas and not much use, but making it not only an amenity for the residents, but also a larger amenity for the community at large. And we've done some quite serious studies. Sorry, this is a little blurry too. Studio Gang did a study, and this is also looking at how do we modernize our buildings, because that's a really big next step for us. Is we've been kind of replacing in kind, which means we've been replacing boilers, we've been replacing facade and brickwork, we've been replacing roofs, but because the buildings are so old, we need to comprehensively deal with these buildings from a kind of ground up approach. And so this is kind of a transition with minimum modification, which is what we've done historically, where we are now, where we're starting our first comprehensive modernization. So full kind of ground up renovation of the building, and then complete modernization is going beyond that. So it's actually adding on to the building, adding on additional space and building more. Oops, oh, it's flipping by itself. Why is it doing that? Okay, sorry. So for the comprehensive modernization, there's actually 2 sites right now, one in Harlem and one in Staten Island. Those will be the first 2 developments that will be completely renovated, all the buildings from the ground up. So ideas, common areas will be redone, the building structure, the units will be redone, looking at completely redoing the energy system. So shifting away from gas and oil dependence for our boilers to fully electric systems, to heat pumps, much more energy efficient. A lot around enclosure to kind of bring them up to passive house standards, improvements on the site and grounds. This is a pilot scheme that's just been released in Queens at Ravenswood. We have our energy and sustainability department is planning to overclad a building, rooftop solar, completely new facade, new windows, heat pumps in the windows so that they heat and cool the space. So the idea is the building is going to be fully electric, energy efficient, and approaching net zero, not quite at net zero, but it's certainly a goal. So that's a pilot scheme. And the overcladding, which to me looks strange, to be honest, was chosen by the residents. So this is what they wanted. So this is what they're getting. Anyways, so here's the kind of typical typology of what you're used to. A couple of examples. This is actually just down the road at Ingersoll. So this was with Marvel. This is an example of a completely new building on the corner, senior housing. It's called Stonewall. These are some other examples. One is on the left one is in the Bronx, and this is proposed by Liebskin. It's also senior housing. So development that's happening on the site to better utilize open space as kind of one-off projects, and examples of the kind of upgrades that we've been involved in. We did recently actually 15 new basketball courts with the NYPD, so completely new for the residents. So this one had a track and it's kind of a great space. This is over in Red Hook. There's the Red Hook Farms, and there's an initiative to do what you're suggesting, which is actually build in farms in our open space and incorporate those in. This is sort of first kind of community-led initiative, but we're incorporating these into our design standards. And there's also, this is hard to see here, but there's also just a new RFP that went out. It's just about to be awarded around green infrastructure. So a really big focus is within the open spaces. How do we plan for what we're calling cloudbursts? So how do we plan for frequent rain events and flooding, particularly in coastal areas? So on the left is basically what we're doing for stormwater management with the DEP. And on the right is an example of a basketball court that actually has hidden below it huge retention tanks to take the stormwater in. And we've been working closely with DEP and a number of really great engineering firms to develop that. This is also in Red Hook. There's a lot of money that came post Sandy to redevelop. So in cases that are flood prone, we are raising the heating plants and all the systems off the ground. So this is on the upper level, you can kind of see through. This is actually going to be a new generator for Red Hook houses, a heating plant, and on the bottom will be retail. So the idea is to kind of redo the infrastructure completely. And then, of course, other things like this is a charter school that came into one of our developments. So mixed use. So it's not just all residential. And again, it's flipping. So there's a number of design guidelines we've both published and are sharing. To be honest, our outward facing resources on our website could be a lot better, but we're a government agency, so there you go. But they are published, and the idea is to kind of circulate those and to, in particular, give them to residents to kind of bolster what I said before is our resident engagement. So that's really kind of a goal moving forward, and to kind of integrate residents' thoughts and direction into our new design guidelines. These are some of the people that we work with and have worked with in the past, because we're kind of not a normal city agency because we receive federal and state funds. We work a lot with the city, but also organizations outside of the city, a lot of private organizations to come up with new ideas. And that's it. So here's a kind of picture of NYCHA. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think our vision for this event, which is the first time that we've run this, was to use it as a launch pad to bring together different constituencies and start a discussion. I think the presentations have been pretty fantastic, and I'm hoping we can spend a few minutes conversing together. I'd like to ask the four panelists if they'd be kind enough to sit up here, and I'd like to ask all the students to try to sit in the front row or two and turn and face all the presenting students to turn and face the audience so we can begin questions or just a general conversation. So give us a minute to get set up, and then I'll try to moderate a brief discussion and Q&A session with everybody. So can you guys come up here? I should also flip the chairs around and The exhibition is up until April the 8th, which is next Friday. So if any of you would like to come back and see it when we're not here, please come back. Yeah, you come up. And I want to just grab the other mic so I can help take Q&A. Okay. Wow. And there's even more students. I mean, all the students who have work in the show should be toward the front, but maybe that's everybody. Many of you are sitting close to the front. Please feel free to go up and turn around and join the discussion. All of the students who are in the show. Great. So I'm happy to kick it off. Does anybody have questions or thoughts? Does anybody else want to kick it off? This is like a yearbook picture here. It's pretty cool. Whoever you want to talk to. Do you have any thoughts, Dylan?
Maybe I'll just kick it off. I had actually more, I thought, the presentations were great and that was exciting to see. I want to know what was your emotional impressions in terms of visiting Farragut, and maybe you could, to put you on the spot, articulate what you think are the most pressing needs for that particular area or particular development.
Just a quick thing, we actually got kicked out.
You got kicked out when you visited. Yeah, that makes sense.
Any students want to share some thoughts about that?
When we visited, it seemed like the lack of congregation spaces was really apparent, because there were people congregating, but it generally happened like outside on the steps and the terraces, right immediately outside of the buildings. So it seems like architectural solutions for that, to create these community spaces, could be really valuable, and relatively simple spaces just where people can meet, talk to people passing by, and join together.
Any other?
I mean, I feel that this is a very interesting encounter between students who are working on a, very relevant, very urgent, and very difficult, very complex topic. Having people of the practice who are dedicated to also making these projects, and we are sitting in the office of an architecture firm who is actively building this type of homes, and then also with Dylan, the kind of city perspective of then, how can this really happen, and I think there's always this transition from school, the great ideas, and then getting into practice, and really having to choose very strategically what is the one battle that you want to fight, because it's going to be impossible to really achieve all the ambitions of kind of balancing shared spaces and private spaces, of introducing incredible landscapes, of I mean, all of the things that we are seeing here that are really important ambitions to have, but that sometimes just go really trashed as you start to engage in the first discussions or just have a conversation on budget, etc. So I think this is, for me, maybe it's not a question, or maybe it's a question for Dylan, and I'm very intrigued to learn, in this kind of future of an institution like NYCHA, what are the opportunities that you're seeing to, to have some of these ideas realized? I think that maybe, for instance, climate change is an opportunity to, through policy, force better construction. No? And we were seeing how, you know, I mean, to see that you were talking about passive house, no? And you to really be able to introduce passive house quality into an affordable housing project, you know, it's just something amazing. But maybe I'm intrigued to see in the new future, from the ideas that the students are bringing, what are things that you could envision or see happening, no? And
Thank you, Deborah. Yeah, there was maybe a slightly loaded question to the students. I don't know if you were reading Gerard's presentation really closely, but one of the big challenges that we're facing is because of the historic disinvestment in public housing. So at a certain point, the federal government kind of walked away and just said, like, New York City, you take care of this, or New York State, you take care of this. So the actual shortfall in terms of the needs for public housing is about $40 billion. So, and as an example, our operating budget over a 5-year funding cycle is about $5 billion. So in essence, we won't catch up unless there's significant investment. But that said, there is really, I think, promising opportunities to translate a lot of your ideas into new policy and new work. And so certainly with what's happening with kind of, let's say, climate resiliency, and there's a new plan, New York City Planning just put in the first comprehensive plan about the waterfront and how to kind of think about all of that holistically in terms of long-term climate needs. And so that is an opportunity that we're seeing with Open Space Master Plan, is to start to think holistically. So it's not just a new playground, but it's a new playground that's also going to catch stormwater, that's also going to serve elderly people, young people. It's going to be a place for gathering. We're going to get rid of the fences, make it more open. So how we utilize public space, I think, is a big aspect. With the comprehensive modernization, there is an opportunity to kind of work from the ground up. And we've sort of been exploring what happens. Could we add on to the buildings? Could we do these kind of winter gardens on the exterior of the buildings? So we add additional floor area. So we've been exploring, I'd say, not quite to the extent that you're doing, because of course, everything costs money, and then there's only so much money and ability to do that. But there are, I wanted to show examples too of one-off buildings on campuses or in developments that do take on a lot of these ideas. And so I think the ideas are exciting, but the challenge is always that it's like, what is the most salient thing? You know, what's your opportunity and chance for change in each of these developments? Because you can't do, even though we'd love to, you can't do it all. You know, we kind of build momentum over time. And I think there's a public perception, particularly among, you know, the people that don't at all interact with the developments, that they're bad, that they shouldn't be invested in. And that's kind of been a particular problem, I'd say, in North America. I think it's different in other countries. You see it in Singapore, in Asia, and I think, sure, David's talked about it. Hong Kong, there's an idea of investment and the importance of that. And I think historically in North America, there hasn't been the same, at least, view for the last maybe 40 or 50 years. But if we can demonstrate that and show how design can change and what it can provide for the residents, then I think we'll start to see investment catch up. And that's what we have to do, because we have basically no choice.
Yeah, I was going to go back to Dylan's question and more about the site visit. When my class went, it was pretty clear that we weren't wanted. And I think that pointed to the fact that the residents of Farragut were pretty disconnected from the residents of their surrounding neighborhood, and finding a way to, you know, socially incline not only us who live in other areas of the city, but residents of these housing facilities to want to interact outside of their neighborhood as well, was something that I sort of picked up on from our visit.
I'm wondering if anybody from FX, if Wendy or Michael might want to share any observations, or Gerard about the particular, or anybody else from FX. We'll give you both mics. Just don't talk.
To answer the young man's statement, we're dealing with generations of knowledge and experience. And it's not just Farragut. Like, there's housing projects that are right next to each other that people don't go into the other campuses, that each one is like its own little kingdom. And you have to stay in your kingdom because it's safe, right? You don't want to go to the other kingdom because it's dangerous. They're bad over there. That we've created this situation, and we as planners, architects, developers, we have to work on solving this problem, on making communities that are inclusive and welcoming and good and sociable and welcoming. The spaces have gotten to the point, and part of his budgets have been cut back. So you just don't use the outside space. There's no purpose to go there. It's a hard problem. It's a very difficult problem to solve. But as she was mentioning, like, that's kind of the opportunity, especially in a time when we have a housing crisis. We don't have enough housing. So how can we step in the gap? I think is the opportunity.
I would just also say that I've been looking at your projects for about a week or so now, walking around. First looking at them, they do look very different than some of the work we've shared, but kind of reading through them, like the kernels of ideas really are very similar. So I think it's the ideas that we're kind of all grappling with. And I think it's kind of to what you were saying, just kind of distilling those ideas and kind of finding the one that you can use and that you can kind of design through that to make an impact through. And kind of, like public and private, or kind of that interior space, or the idea of flexibility. So I think this starts out like kind of very large industrial, but also when I was talking about complexity contained, and taking all that complexity and containing in something that is something tangible and impactful.
Any other students want to share an observation? It is not early, and we do have a reception. Q, yeah, please.
Less so an observation about our own site visit, and more so about your own experiences as either NYCHA workers or people creating affordable housing. There seems to be a buffer zone or a weird time gap that happens where we actually see the results of what we're designing maybe every 10 years, but there's also legislation in place that sort of kills whatever development that you can provide. For instance, there is an act that says, okay, if you build a new building and it's next to affordable housing, then for the next 10 years, there has to be a certain amount of units that are affordable in your building. But after 10 years, it's over. You can raise the rent. You can do whatever you want to with the building. Why does that continue? Why is there still legislation like that when it takes 10 years to see the production?
Any thoughts about that from anybody? Talk about timelines, gestation periods. Do you want to share a couple of thoughts? Yeah, Wendy can give you the mic.
In the news, like 2 days ago, Governor Hochul, with her new budget address, that was one of the things that was protested, and people were carried away. I think there are questions about what's the best model for affordable housing, and the short answer is we don't have a good model. We have many models, and I don't think it's really going to be one solution. But historically, I think there has been, a disinvestment and a kind of disinterest in the really long-term planning that's necessary. And it's partially, I would say, the way our political system works on a very short cycle. So it's very short-sighted. But it is generational differences. And so it is true. In 10 years, you'll probably just start to see that change. And I think that's what happens is we're kind of slow to catch up, and we want to see instant results because the officials, I think, that are writing the laws, they're there for 4 years maybe, and they want to see something tangible in those 4 years. But it needs to be a long-term vision. And I think that's when larger agencies planning has to come into the fold, and I think has to be part of the conversation because, yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Is there another question? Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I really enjoyed the presentation today. My name is Pam Lockley, and I am representing Assemblywoman Nikki Lucas. And I wanted to address your concerns because that's one of her concerns as well. And we're looking into legislation about extending those restrictions and to make it, like you said, long-term affordability, because 10 years is not enough. The excuses that we've heard is that the developers or the people who are funding these projects are not wanting it longer, but we have to let them know that they have to please the people. So I will be bringing a report back to her about this, but we've had these discussions before. And she is definitely, because this work is wonderful. This is beautiful work I've seen tonight. And I know she'll be very happy to hear this. But I just wanted to let you know that we appreciate your efforts. And I just had a question, if I may, and that's about durability. One of the concerns that residents have about so-called new projects is the durability. We've had, we're near the Gateway, and everyone knows about the buildup with the Gateway. And within 2 years, residents are having problems with floods, the grounds are shifting. And this is one of the things that makes residents very hesitant about new projects because they don't see the standard being kept. So I just wonder from NYCHA, are you aware and are you going to be diligent about making sure that the workmanship is done? Because after all of this talent has been put forth, we don't want to see their work disrespected by not having it done properly.
Anybody want to take that? I can share some thoughts. Thank you very much. Very important issue. Did anybody want to respond? Yeah.
I just want to add to the, to the conversation that, to your comment specifically, I think there's a very complicated network of agents, that have a strong play in, the outcome of these projects, I'm an architect who has never been able to do multifamily housing because, we were more associated to cultural buildings, more special projects. And now we are trying to actually build multifamily housing and build through offsite construction and introducing innovation. And in the last years, we've had so many conversations with cities, with developers, with contractors on how to make the math work. How do you are able to make affordable housing that is good quality, where the developer gains money, and because otherwise they're not incentivized. How do you incentivize construction companies to work better quality or use different methodologies that are more efficient, that allow to lower the budgets, etc. So I think it's not just cities, it's not just the developers. I'm sure developers would love to build affordable housing. It's just that the math doesn't work because construction cost is super high in the US, for instance, right? Projects that you are able to do in other parts of the world. Here, it's very difficult because of other things. So in a way, how do you incentivize maybe construction companies to introduce innovation or introduce methodologies that are more efficient, right? So that you don't waste the money in inefficient construction, for instance, no? Or how do you support developers so that the math works for them? How do you, so, you know, I think it's not just, you know, in a way, everybody would love, I think, no, I've come to this conclusion, everybody would love to build affordable housing and better housing, but everybody wants also to make a business out of it, right? So I think even for architects, for us, it's very difficult. No, how do you really bring all this richness of ideas into reality, but make it work within a budget and a situation? So I think, in a way, you have to be very aware of all of these different dimensions so that you start to be part of the conversation. And I do think that architects should be part of the conversation, and we are not enough part of the conversation.
Hold on to that for a second.
Thank you. And a shameless plug, we have a real estate program at Pratt. And we talk about stuff like that with our students. That not only how do you make it beautiful, but like, how do you raise the money to do this? You know, where do you get the debt? Where do you get the equity? Where do you get the subsidies? Where do you get the tax abatement? You know, that's a big thing right now, Dylan. That all of that has to go into the soup to make this thing work, right? If you look across America, suburbia, the reason that happened is because the government incentivized the creation of it, and it was profitable for the builder. It was profitable for the homeowner. It was profitable for the city. So like that proliferated. That, you know, New York City is kind of struggling with how do we make that profitable for the people who are involved in it? Because if it isn't, then they stop. And you have this start and stop thing. And, you know, cities like New York and LA, we're not making it fast enough, right? And LA is an extreme example. They're not making enough of it, right? So now there's people living on the street because there's more people that want to live there than it is shelter to put everybody in a cost efficient manner. So I wanted to respond to her, I think, to your comment, which is how can we sustain it after we build the building? The quality of the building. You know, and one of the things I said in the presentation, like, you know, the federal government has kind of gotten out of the business of doing this. And RAD is one of the ways at which, you know, they figured we can incentivize private people to come and pay for this and take financial responsibility, which is a big thing. Like, you know, lots of things that happen in public housing, if it was a private developer would get in a lot of trouble, right? But they're the government. So like nobody really gets in trouble. No individual is responsible. Versus if you have a affordable housing building and you don't have the heat on, right? You get a fine, you personally get in trouble. There's people who are responsible. You know, public housing has had this problem that the federal government isn't paying for it anymore, and half the country doesn't want to pay for it, basically. So it's very tough calculus. It's very tough.
I definitely think the issues of finance and durability, I mean, these are themes we've been speaking about with our critic at large. Gerard, you've been involved in some of those sessions to blend discourse. I mean, I think it's important in an architecture school to begin to think about those things which often have not historically been on the table around reviews. And it's been exciting to see that emerge in the discourse over the past couple of years in the GAUD. You know, I need to say I am incredibly proud of the students and the work that they've brought to the table tonight. It is deeply impressive. And, you know, I really sincerely admire it. And the title, Real Estates, is to, you know, on one hand, make this real. how can we make this real, to open the door to that discussion. How do we balance speculative enthusiasm with other measures of reality and not fall back into entrenched binary behavior where it's one or the other? Estates it's an effort to, understand that there's an identity politic to this. An estate is a thing, but it's also huge amounts of people. How can you call that one thing? The multivalence of what we call in North America campuses, but internationally it would be called a public housing estate, has immense diversity, and yet whatever we do to it, it will have an identity politic associated with it that I think is important on a symbolic and representational level, and factors into a lot of the thinking in these discussions. And it is incredible to get a panel of different experts, from educators to different kinds of architects and developers and elected official representatives in a firm that's doing a lot of work in this area, into a room with their faculty who've been very surprisingly quiet in the back of the room, in a space together. And I think, that's pretty special. And I hope the start of ongoing discussions. This was really intended to be a launch pad, and it's exciting and frightening at the same time to think about how to work on these issues. But these sessions are kind of therapeutic as much as they should drive anxieties and enthusiasms when we leave the room. So thank you, everybody. And again, to FX for their incredible generosity. We're the inaugural exhibition, right, Dan? Yeah.
I'm Dan Kaplan, senior partner, and I really have to say that the work is so interesting. We've been walking around it for a week, and what I really admire about it is, the not the attempt, but the full-throated, full embrace of the densification aspect of and reimagining of these campuses in such, all of them have their qualities. So all the projects have their qualities, but no one's shirking away from really going at the real issues. And it was really inspiring. We're very happy to host you, and we'd love to do it again. And I think it is, David, and everybody, a beautiful dialogue of all, interdisciplinary dialogue, and especially with a assembly member representative too, which is always good. So I guess the hors d'oeuvres are open. Yeah. Yes.
I was trying to get you actually to come, maybe do that in the call. Because I have these mini lectures with the students.
Cool. Okay.
Like half an hour with different topics.
For sure. Definitely.
Feed them a copy. I did one. And,
Okay.
but I would-
Please. Yes, please. I'd love that. Thank you. Thank you. Hey. I teach urban economics, and I teach portfolio real estate investing.
And then what's the handout? Like, I'm interested in those.
Those are decisions that the developer makes.
Thanks.